Thank you, Your Worship, and members of council. So Phil Dack is my name, and I've been a planner for 40 years since I started at the city around 1980. And during my career here, I, with the communities, wrote many of the ARPs which are still in place, including that Killarney-Glengarry one that was talked about yesterday, which I would say is still doing fine even after 25 years. I don't have anything specifically to say about the content of the guidebook today. Probably a relief for you. You'll hear more than enough about that from others. In fact, my presentation will be short and a bit boring, as I just want to explain a single legal point, and that is about this misinformation which we've heard and such. And that, so the planners have been very clear that approving the guidebook won't change the zoning or land use in communities. And many councillors have repeated that position. In fact, it is true that approving the guidebook will not immediately change the land uses in Calgary communities, except for the North Hill communities, because you're going to approve that likely after the guidebook if you approve them. However, approving the guidebook absolutely will legally force the changing of land uses and zoning over a period. Now, the mayor made some of what I thought were the wisest and most common sense statements about this whole issue a few days ago, about the possibility of not having the guidebook approved as a statutory document. So let's just talk about statutory and non-statutory.
Oh, fuck, dude.
So what is the difference between a statutory document and a simple council policy? Well as needing a public hearing to change it, statutory plans have huge power in land use planning. Now, quoting from the MGA, and incidentally, I told the city solicitor that I was going to present this, and I sent her some of my notes. So if any council member wishes to confirm the veracity of my comments, I invite them to speak to the solicitor. So I want to quote from the MGA, section 638.2. An area redevelopment plan, and these days we're calling area redevelopment plans in Calgary local area plans. An area redevelopment plan must be consistent with, and that's the important phrase, an ARP or a local area plan must be consistent with any municipal development plan, and then my words, and of course any appendices to the municipal development plan, i.e. the guidebook, because it's being approved as an appendix. Then, from the Calgary Charter Regulation, it says, section 635.5, which is now included in the MGA, the city may, by bylaw, adopt one or more, quote, additional statutory plans. And that's what the guidebook is being approved as, an additional statutory plan. The MGA goes on to say, 635.1 sub 2, an additional statutory plan referred to in subsection 1 must be consistent with any area redevelopment plan, i.e. any local area plan. So what this means is that any local area plan must be consistent with, i.e. can't be different than or opposed to, must be consistent with the guidebook and vice versa. Therefore, if the guidebook says that Map A communities should allow all levels of low density, including townhouses, then an LAP prepared with all the community input in the world cannot disagree with it. Similarly, the land use bylaw is a statutory plan, so it must be consistent with the guidebook and any local area plan. The new land use bylaw will have to be written based on the urban form-based categories. Now, there may be some minor technical ways around this, in some cases, by creating special areas, such as Councillor Gondik suggests. But the principle still absolutely stands. Local area plans must follow the guidebook.
Mr. Dack,
So please,
Mr. Dack, you are at time, although I'm really finding this super interesting. You are at time, and we do have 130 people left to go, so I will ask you to wrap up in one sentence, please.
Okay. Okay, so please be clear, very clear, members of council, if you approve the guidebook as a statutory document today, you are also determining the basic land use policies of all the local area plans that follow it from it. Now, this may be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your position on the guidebook. But once you stick your toe in that water and approve the guidebook, you can't back off. Thank you very much, members of council, and I certainly feel for you having to go through this, and I am so appreciative of the work that you're doing for us all.
Thank you, Mr. Dack, and thank you for all your service to the community as well. Let's go to Ms. Poole, please. Are you there?
I'm here.
Great. Everyone else, please mute, and let's give the floor to Ms. Poole for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
I'm just waiting for everyone to mute. Oh, there we go, I think.
Yeah, you're good. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Your worship and city councillors, I love Calgary, and I want our communities to be great. But the current version of the Guidebook for Great Communities is not going to get us there. I sincerely appreciate the years of work that have been invested in creating the Guidebook and agree with many of its principles. However, due to a lack of meaningful public involvement, it's an incomplete plan. Shouldn't the goal be to create the best final product? If so, there should have been a greater effort to understand the unique characteristics of each community by engaging the residents of each community in discussions about the role their community might play in the future of Calgary, right from the start of this project. Public engagement, I'm hearing the feedback here.
We can still hear you. Go ahead.
Public engagement can be time-consuming and messy, and you don't always get the answers that you want. But time saved by skipping this important step has led to the creation of a document that a growing number of Calgarians oppose. As Calgary continues to grow and evolve, these important conversations need to take place in a transparent public forum of vigorous debate and dialogue, not in the confines of the City Planning Department with token public input. Done well, meaningful public engagement brings forth solutions that might not otherwise be considered. Some people want to live in higher density neighborhoods, others do not. What might be considered an elite enclave of protectionism by some is valued as an important part of Calgary's history by others. The sweeping changes proposed in the Guidebook for Great Communities does not adequately address these different perspectives. Regardless of one's perspective, the belittling of those who express concerns about a lack of clarity and the lack of transparency is unacceptable. Instead of ignoring or attempting to discredit growing public opposition, the City of Calgary should acknowledge there has been insufficient public involvement relative to the impact of the proposed changes, and that there is a tremendous amount of confusion about what the impact of the Guidebook could be. The local area plan only provides an illusion of choice, as the options are pre-selected. Communities should be allowed to make decisions based on what best meets the needs and preferences of their community and not be confined to the limited options that are offered. The reason that I'm speaking to you today is because I sincerely want Calgary to be an innovative, vibrant, resilient city that is a great place to live and work for all its citizens. But the proposed Guidebook for Great Communities in its current form will not get us there. Density at all costs is old school thinking. Until communities are actively involved in the co-design of a vision for Calgary's future, and the implications of the proposed changes can be clearly communicated and agreed upon by all stakeholders, the version of the Guidebook for Great Communities should not be approved. Thank you for the opportunity to express my concerns.
Thank you very much, Ms. Poole. Let's go to Ms. Siebens, please. Are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
You sound great. Please go ahead. You've got 5 minutes.
Oh, good morning, Your Worship and City Councillors. And I'd like to start by pointing out that all of us here today, City Councillors, Your Worship, City Representatives, all of the citizens that are listening and that have decided to speak, care deeply about this city. And it reminds me of parents raising a child where sometimes arguments ensue. And this is inevitable. All of us care about this, and we want this to be successful. And sometimes the best solution is a compromise. So that's what I would like to speak to today. We all want the Guidebook for Great Communities to be successful because there are some fantastic features in it. It's clearly an expansive document. You've done a lot of work. So as I waded through this very large document, imagine my dismay when I'm looking at it through the lens of my community. I live in one of the floodplain inner city communities of Roxborough. And I said, oh, okay, they want to do a little bit of density on the connectors. Oh, wait a minute, it's not just the connectors for my neighborhood. Oh, yes, they want to put, maybe a little bit of row housing there where it makes sense. Oh, no, this applies to my whole neighborhood. The list of criteria to even have a small pocket of single-family dwelling homes is impossible given the current guidebook. You've gone from 0 to 100 instead of 0 to 60. And I guess I can't help but look at it like a great business deal, or even some people say a great divorce settlement. Sometimes compromise is the solution. There's an old saying, when both sides feel like they've been a little bit hard done by, sometimes that is the best way forward and the most fair solution. And I guess I don't want this guidebook to be set up for failure. I feel like we're setting it up for a turf war. I even use, again, our community as Roxborough as an example. It was established at the turn of the last century. And at the time of its establishment, restrictive covenants were used to protect the planning intent, which were 50-foot wide lots with single-family homes. And there's currently a constellation of restrictive covenants registered on individual titles. And so, I don't want this to be a turf war. The city and the taxpayers don't want this to be a turf war. And I just want everybody to pause for a minute. And the ideology of the guidebook is fantastic, but I think a little bit of reality needs to sneak in there. And so I'm really begging councillors to take a moment and ask themselves if possibly a little bit of compromise might be the most graceful way forward. There's some things that were nowhere mentioned in the guidebook. The little things like the communities in the floodplain. We don't even have Springbank upstream mitigation approved yet. And even once it's approved, fingers crossed, increased lot coverage in the floodplain will always be an issue. We'll always have minor flooding. And so little things like, taking a 45-foot lot coverage to 60 feet is massive in the floodplain. And things like that haven't been considered. So I just think it would be wise and prudent to maybe take this back to administration or to strongly consider some of the stronger amendments, like the Alboya Amendment, because I think possibly in 20 years we can all look back and go, maybe some pockets of single-family dwellings, which have always existed in Calgary, maybe that's not so bad. Maybe it's desirable. I know that's what I want. And it's not that I don't want density. I do want some density, but I think it's okay to have some of these communities remain single-family dwellings. Some of the greatest cities in the world have a great mix of high density and low density neighborhoods. I'd like to think Calgary could be one of those. I think Calgary is a great city, and we all want to improve upon it. We all want to modernize and move forward. But I just think the guidebook, in its exact current form, doesn't get us there. So please consider taking it back to administration, and please consider a little bit of compromise in all of us. This doesn't have to be as polarized as it is, but I think a mature outcome, some of the greatest people, leaders, city planners, citizens, the path forward is a little bit of compromise to find a graceful solution to this.
We're just at time. I really appreciate your comments. Thank you so much for taking your time and being with us this morning. Ms. Gillespie,
Thank you.
Ms. Gillespie, are you with us?
I am.
All right, everyone else, please mute, and you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor, and councillors for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Flora Gillespie. I wish to start off by saying that I appreciate Councillor Diane Collier-Urquhart's statement yesterday with respect to the councillor's obligation to be open-minded and non-judgmental before the public hearing, and I hope all councillors are just as respectful to me. Yesterday it was said that citizens like myself were misled, misinformed, and fearful. I don't believe this to be true, and I ask that any preconceived notions are set aside and that so that my concerns can be heard. The guidebook has been presented by administration as a roadmap that will address unemployment, inequality, racism, mental health, heritage preservation, streetscape improvements, business revitalization, etc. I agree with all these concepts and also think sprawl is a problem that the city should be addressing. My question is, will the guidebook be successful in doing so? Not in my view. I'm not a planner. I am just a citizen, but not in my view. The guidebook streamlines, or rather deregulates, the development process. I see no incentives for developers to achieve these goals, very lofty goals. This should have been a fundamental part of the guidebook, in my opinion. A great opportunity has been missed, and instead it appears the city is giving away valuable density for free. I also feel engagement was very limited. In August 2019, the guidebook for great communities was released. It was not an updated version of the already existing developed areas guidebook, as expected, but a complete shift in philosophy. Policies of social engineering were suddenly introduced. It was stripped of amendments that had been added to the original guidebook and meant to become statutory with the intent of providing the foundation and the requirement for a revised land use bylaw. The original guidebook, developed areas guidebook, that is, had consolidated existing policies in one place, a good start. A stakeholder group was formed. Unfortunately, it was invite only. A handful of communities were involved, but they were not allowed to keep materials in any of the meetings. Other communities who asked to join were denied. The guidebook is my last point is, the guidebook is a statutory plan which will restrict a community's abilities to provide criticism for any of these new developments. And finally, the elephant in the room is that city administration seems to have chosen to try flying under the radar on the guidebook's approach to low-density areas by limiting engagement. Rather, they should have been leading and taken the opportunity, actually, to lead an open and fulsome discussion on the need to and how best to redevelop and densify established low-density area. I think it's time to address the elements. I request that the guidebook be referred back to administration for another look. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Ms. Gillespie. Do we have Mr. Marsh?
Yes. Good morning, Your Worship and members of Council. My name is Jeff Marsh, and I'm on the Board of Directors of the Helmsfield Heights Briar Hill Community Association. My portfolio is strategic planning and land use, So that means that part of my job is to sell community revitalization to our residents. And honestly, in that regard, my reaction to the Guidebook is probably much like that of a new car salesman at a Ford dealership in 1958 when the first Edsel rolled into the showroom. Really? You want me to sell that? The Edsel was developed as a car of the future, and Ford spent a great deal of time and effort developing it, but the public just didn't like it, and despite extensive marketing by Ford, it only sold for a couple of years. Now, there wasn't anything inherently wrong with the car. After all, it had a lot of thought and design behind it. So perhaps, with different marketing and maybe a few tweaks here and there, it could have enjoyed much greater success. And that's very much how I feel about the Guidebook, at least how it's written right now. So first, let's consider the marketing angle. I think everyone agrees that this is a policy that's designed to revolutionize how our city evolves into the future. As such, I'd suggest it's pretty important that not only should almost every Calgarian at least be aware of it, but Calgarians also should have a good understanding of how it's expected to change their community on a street-by-street level. However, the reality of the situation is that up until a few weeks ago, when this hearing was announced and our CA brought it to the attention of our residents, the vast majority of them had absolutely no idea that it even existed. A huge amount of media attention over the past few weeks demonstrates that the Guidebook's been a surprise to many, and all the claims of misinformation flying around show that something about the engagement, well, just hasn't gone down quite as it should have. Hence, as a city, I'd suggest we really very much need to press pause on this, figure out a way to better educate the public about the Guidebook, and specifically how their particular neighborhood is likely to evolve on a block-by-block basis under its guidance. And in the interest of basic goodwill, this very much needs to be done prior to approval, not as an afterthought. Folks need to feel as if they've been consulted and been able to have their say, and not just at the last minute at a public hearing as we find ourselves today. Next, let's consider some design tweaks. When I'm out there trying to sell community revitalization, the common theme that I hear over and over and over is that our residents want certainty. Specifically, they want certainty in terms of understanding what different areas of the community, their streetscape, and probably most importantly, the dwellings adjacent to them are going to look like in the future. The problem is that with the low-density forms of all intensities being merged into the single urban form of neighborhood local, there's just no way that a local area plan can be developed under the current Guidebook framework that would provide as much certainty in this regard as our existing area redevelopment plan does. Yes, there is a very strong desire within Hounsfield Heights, Briar Hill to retain our ARP. However, I'm going to suggest to you that based on my observation, that isn't so much about people not wanting to see change as much as it is about them wanting to avoid uncertainty. Additional granularity in the Guidebook framework that allows the different intensities of the low-density forms to be individually mapped out in a local area plan would provide our residents with exactly the kind of certainty they're seeking. As a community, we'd be much more open to relinquishing our existing ARP and embracing a new LAP that will allow for change and evolution. Additional granularity also has the advantage of enabling increased intensity to be focused where it's most needed rather than simply ending up splattered throughout the community as likely to happen under the current framework. The Alboya Amendment, as previously proposed, would go a long way in this regard. But with all due respect, even though the amendment is written, I really don't believe it's something that Council can simply bolt in on the fly. This is important, and the Guidebook needs to be referred back to administration, just temporarily, so our planning experts can integrate this amendment properly into the policy and bring it back to the public in a modified form. Thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thanks very much, Mr. Marsh. And that brings us to the end of this panel. So I will say thank you very much to everyone on this panel, and we're going to go now to the next panel. And the next panel, I believe, is one joint presentation from the Calgary Climate Hub. Do we have the Calgary Climate Hub folks with us? Mr. Morrison, are you here?
Your Worship, Jeremy Park is here. I believe myself and Councillor Carra had questions.
Oh, I'm sorry. They rolled up my screen here. Before we do that, hopefully the other people have not yet hung up. We'll go to Councillor Carra, please. I don't see you at all, Councillor Farkas. Where did you go? Oh, there you are. Okay, yeah. Councillor Farkas first. Councillor Farkas first. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. Phil, are you still on the line?
Mr. Dack, are you there?
Lisa, are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here.
Great, Lisa. So thanks so much for being here as well as your great presentation. So my question is, I have two questions for you. The first is, you've been very involved. You, Jane, Margot, and others have been very involved in interacting with administration, engaging through these workshops and so forth. Did you see changes that you requested be incorporated into the guidebook? And I guess my question for you is, to what extent do you think this guidebook has changed as a result of what the citizens have been telling City Council and city staff?
Well, I actually think, to be perfectly honest, I have only been involved. I became informed last November, so I was not necessarily part of the group that were asking for some of the original amendments. I do understand that amendments have been made, but I don't think that they represent the amendments that were requested. And I think that the community, speaking for our community, would like to see further amendments. It's just like we just don't feel like it's quite there yet.
And do you think the best way to make the changes that are needed would be on the floor of council here through amendments, or do you think that this should go back to administration for them to be able to spend some time in the coming weeks and months with you before bringing it back to council?
I absolutely agree that trying to make an amendment on the fly would be a mistake. I think if our goal is to truly have the best final product, that we need to have thoughtful conversation and we need to make sure that we get it right.
And my last question is more along the lines of the future. Where do you think we go from here? What do you think the best path forward is? I know that many people around the council table have been urging for, say, plain language, speaking clearly, that sort of thing, but it seems by most accounts the city has somewhat botched the approach in presenting a 100-page plus document that is confusing not just to ordinary citizens, but to many people who actually have the planning expertise and the background. So do we need to slim down the guidebook? Does the guidebook need its own guidebook? If you could pick a perfect future going forward, how do you think we would best proceed from here?
Well, that's a big question. What I would say is whatever form the guidebook takes, that it's of critical importance that people understand what the proposed change, what the impact might be. And I also truly believe, given the magnitude of the proposed change, that every effort has to be taken to make sure that people are aware of it and that they understand and they have the opportunity to provide their input. And I know that's time consuming, and as I said, public engagement is easy, but I personally believe that there is tremendous value in that process and that we can end up with the best possible final product if we take the time to do it.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks as well for your advocacy.
Excuse me. Councillor Carra, please.
Did we lose Mr. Dack?
We might have. Phil, are you still there?
My question was...
No, I think we did.
All right. I just want to say I want to give a shout out to Mr. Dack. He's the guy who basically saved Inglewood. When he wrote the Inglewood ARP, he wrote the flood protection berm in, and that's what kept the streets of Inglewood dry because it was actually affected through a local area plan. My question to him was going to be, how have we done in terms of syncing up our policy intentions to date with our local area plans and our land use? And the answer to that is badly, and there are problems with that, and that's exactly what we're trying to rectify here. But we'll explore that later. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thanks very much. Councillor Keating, please.
No, thank you, Your Worship. Asked and answered.
Thanks very much, Councillor Keating. Now we will go to our next panel, please. So as I said, this is a joint panel from the Calgary Climate Hub. So Mr. Morrison, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. Mr. Longson, oh, I don't know if that's Mr. or Ms. Chris Longson, are you there? How about Natalie Robertson?
Yep, I'm here.
And Byron Miller, Dr. Miller, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, who was
Hello, Your Worship.
Yes, is that Chris?
No, this is Phil Dack. I understand that.
Oh, Phil, excuse me, if you don't mind, Climate Hub folks, thanks for coming back, Phil. I apologize, that was my fault. Did you hear Councillor Carraw's question for you?
I didn't. No, sorry.
Councillor Carraw, can you repeat it in few words?
I can, unless you want to try and take a run at it, Your Worship.
Well, I'll start from the beginning, which he said he wanted to give you his special thanks because he called you the man who saved Inglewood. In the area redevelopment plan for Inglewood that put in the berm and saved the neighborhood from flooding. But he did have a question for you, so go ahead, Councillor Carraw.
Yeah, I mean, and the point of that is that this empowers the next generation of local area plans that will drive investment, public improvement investments that will improve our neighborhoods, and that's one of the reasons why I love the Guidebook. But my question to you, Phil, is you point out rightly that the city is beholden to line up all of its policy and land use intentions. And my question to you is, how are we doing right now? Are we fully aligned between our land use and our municipal development plan and our local area plans, or do we have some serious gaps that need bridging?
It's pretty scattered, Councillor Carraw, to say the least. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it's pretty scattered. We in West Hillhurst are trying to understand whether, for instance, the Main Street policies apply to us or don't apply to us, or the Guidebook applies to us. So there's a lot of confusion, Your Worship.
So would you say, as a professional planner who's been a major figure in the local area planning process, that a new system that aligns our municipal development plan and our regional obligations with our infrastructure reinvestment and with all of our policy and eventually our land use is the ideal that we should be shooting towards?
Yes, absolutely. The situation here is, I think that 95% of people are supportive of the Guidebook, except for that, the R1, R2 question. And if we could manage that, I think that the Guidebook has tremendous work gone into it, some great policies, and I look forward to seeing those things implemented. I'm just, my heart hurts, as I'm sure all members of council does, about the opposition on this R1, R2 question.
Well, I mean, I guess I would ask you, as I read the Guidebook, it sort of reverses the mixed use. Right now, the mixed use neighborhood is the exceptional circumstance, and I'm looking out at Bridgeland Riverside out of my window as I talk to you, Mr. Dack, and the single use community is more of the rule of city building in the past, and the Guidebook basically reverses that and says that the mixed use neighborhood is now the rule going forward, and the single use character area or whatever is the exceptional circumstance to be determined through a local area plan. If that was more clearly spelled out, do you think it would be good?
Yes, I think that, there may be some communities, Meadowlark Park or some communities, which can be a single community. Maybe the local area plan, multi-communities. Council should be saying that we're looking for opportunities to increase density wherever we can. It used to be on major roads and corridors in LRT station areas. and that was great. Everyone accepted that for 10 or 15 years. Maybe it didn't work well enough, but for some reason the guidebook, to me, seems to want to paint the whole inner area with this higher density, with the higher density or the multifamily color. I know in West Hillhurst, we've talked about, like this, the planning committee has talked about, okay, can we increase densities along Fifth Avenue, along Kensington Road, along Crowchild? So we were looking to be good Calgarians at ways of increasing the density in the areas that made sense in the community. The guidebook, Councillor Carra, as you know, it's created all of this, I think, unnecessary angst. I don't think that a lot of redevelopment to the townhouses is actually going to happen, except in the areas that it makes sense. But it's a question of, do we fine-tune and work with the communities to figure out the best place to put an additional 10% dwelling units in each community, or do we paint everything with the townhouse brush? And I don't know, Councillor Carra. Being a community planner, I like working with communities, and I think that the communities are pretty open to. I've never heard it. Really, I've heard very few communities saying no additional density. So if we have time to work with individual communities at saying where the additional density should go, that would be the easiest and best way. The way that the guidebook proposes, well, we see the animosity and the angst which that generates.
Let me ask you it this way, because I have a tremendous amount of respect for your abilities as a planner. But I mean, I guess I challenge the idea of multifamily. What the guidebook is suggesting is that your base rule for your lowest density allows a mix of lower density residential forms that in the traditional communities, and the mixed-use communities that are the model moving forward, used to exist, and about 50, 60 years ago got zoned out of existence. I've had many tours of Inglewood with people who are concerned about row houses, and I've taken them to historic row houses in the community, and historic cottage rows in the community, and historic small apartment buildings in the community that got zoned out of existence when we said it's the single-family house or it's higher density.
So, Councillor Carra, you know what I'm going to say.
Am I debating? So I guess my question, to Mr. Dack is, if we're trying to use the mixed-use neighborhood as the rule, does it not make sense to have as a base level density that historic intermix of low-density forms that have traditionally lived in our communities, and make more exclusively, zoned areas the exception and not the rule?
Wow, that's very well put, Councillor Carra. And we have beautiful examples in Inglewood, especially, of old townhouses 100 years old. And I don't have the answer to your question. The words sound great, and then when humans actually have to implement them, all sorts of other things happen. I really feel, to me, Calgary would lose a great deal if we lost Mount Royal or Scarborough or Elbow Park. I'll never be able to afford to live in those places, but I drive through there, and I love the beauty of them, and I'm glad they're part of Calgary. And your arguments about sensitive town housing in communities makes a lot of sense too. As I said, in West Hillhurst, we're an R2 community, but we're totally open to having more. I shouldn't say that officially, but we are open to having much more town housing if it's put in particular areas. So I don't know the answer to your question about how to sensitively. Your theory is right. How to make it happen sensitively, Councillor Carra, I really don't know the answer.
I appreciate your input. Mr. Dack. I guess to say, if I've learned anything from watching you over the years, I believe the answer to the question you're asking is through very thoughtful local area planning process, which is exactly what this guidebook enshrines. And, maybe Councillor Gondek's amendment, which papers that special policy area with regard to single detached form, is the way to go to just make it a lot clearer and give more direction when we sit down and actually engage with communities. Thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation. I won't take any more time, but really appreciate your weighing in, Mr. Dack.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mayor, if I could just thank the city clerk for moving my presentation to this morning, because I didn't have to cancel my doctor's appointment. So if you could just pass on my real appreciation to the city clerk.
Yeah, they thank you. They appreciate it. I can see them now. They're happy to have done it. My doctor's appointment is Monday at 8 a.m., and I'm hoping I won't have to cancel it. So with that in mind, let's move forward, shall we? All right, third time lucky. I'm turning it over to you, Mr. Morrison. Are you the one starting here?
Yes, I'm the one starting.
All right, go ahead.
I have a PowerPoint presentation.
All right, we'll get it up.
Would you be able to bring it up?
It is up. You're good to go.
Okay, it's got a white background with green edges because we've got a couple of those. Great, thank you very much. This is a joint presentation on behalf of the Calgary Climate Hub and Sustainable Calgary. I will be joined by, hopefully today, in one way or another, 3 passionate, experienced volunteers who know what it takes to create great communities. They are Chris Longson, an engineer with a keen understanding of how Calgary's neighborhoods have evolved and continue to evolve. Natalie Robertson, an expert on building resilient, thriving communities. And Byron Miller, a scholar at the University of Calgary whose work focuses on neighborhood change and urban sustainability. A copy of our submission is on page 480 of attachment 16. Next slide, please. Let us be clear, we support approval of the guidebook. Next slide, please. The guidebook is essential. The city's planning has not kept up with what our communities need. The guidebook provides the opportunity to move beyond simply building things. Instead, our communities can become complete communities and realize their full potential. Next slide, please. However, you have the opportunity to make the guidebook better today and in the future. For today, we will offer some important strategic recommendations to improve the guidebook. You will also hear other positive suggestions from other Calgarians. We know that you will seriously consider those suggestions, and we're also sure that Council and administration will be able to distill what you heard yesterday and today, and prior to will bring in a set of constructive guidebook to allay concerns and build upon what the public has told you. Next slide, please. If you turn to page 2 of our submission, I will begin with what we consider 2 easy amendments on urban forestry. The first amendment is to include the urban forestry requirements from the Municipal Development Plan. If you don't build those requirements into the guidebook, they will easily be forgotten or ignored. The second amendment is to set targets and responsibilities in local area plans for meeting the city's urban forestry goals. Expanding the urban canopy not only makes sense for more pleasant neighborhoods, it is a valuable contribution to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please.
Suggested by others.
Mr. Morrison, we're just we can still hear you, but we're getting a teensy bit of feedback. So I just want to tell everyone to look at their phones and please hit mute. There, it's gone. Go ahead.
Great, thank you very much. We're on the one with the orange hand, I think.
Correct.
We have listened to the concerns raised by Calgarians about what the guidebook may mean for their neighborhoods. Given the new and untested nature of the guidebook, we understand those concerns. These concerns are to a large extent about rezoning. Although we believe that rezoning should take place after a local area plan has been approved, we recognize that is unlikely without revisions to the land use bylaw. Instead, we are looking for Council to approve a 2-year moratorium on rezoning in residential areas that are outside main streets and activity centers. This will create some breathing space to allow the Guidebook to prove its value. It will also allow the city to clearly define community-appropriate designations of main streets and activity centers and step up its focus on high-density areas to enhance and attract the services that communities need. Next slide, please. And for the future, we are asking Council to commit to direct administration within 2 years to revise the Guidebook. The Guidebook does not adequately address the urgent issues our city faces. These issues are climate change, inequality, incomplete communities, an unsustainable transportation system, and lack of affordable housing. The connections to those issues need to be strong, certainly stronger than they are now, and strong enough to actually make a difference to our city and our communities. In that way, the Guidebook can protect and support all Calgarians and the environment we rely on. Our future depends on making sure the Guidebook is up to those challenges. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thanks very much, Mr. Morrison. Let's go to Mr. Longson, please.
Can you hear me?
We sure can. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you, Your Worship and Councillors, for your continued patience in listening to us. My name is Chris Longson, and I'm speaking to you on behalf of the Calgary Climate Hub and Sustainable Calgary. I'm also, incidentally, a resident of Elbow Park. So for my part in this, I want to touch on a couple of aspects which seem to be at the heart of many people's concerns, and that is access to sunlight and transition. And by transition, I mean the process and timeline of how we get from where we are today to whatever we decide is a plan for each local area. Oh, by the way, I do have some slides. Have you got those up at all?
One moment.
Yep.
We still have Mr. Morrison's slides up, so we'll just do a switcheroo here. My apologies.
Yeah, no, okay, I should have reminded you. So it's titled Solar Access and Development Transitions.
It's just coming.
Okay, good.
I promise not to sing to fill the moment here. But I can see the clerk's fingers moving very quickly. She's getting it up. All right, it is up. Go ahead.
Okay, just go to slide 2. Okay, so the importance of sunlight on our properties and public spaces, I don't think can be understated. So we're very pleased to see that there is a section on that in the Guidebook. But we think the wording needs to be strengthened to ensure that this issue is addressed in all the new local area plans. I believe nothing upsets residents more than the prospect of a new 10 or 12 metre wall right beside their yard or window or favourite public green space. So the Guidebook, as drafted, gives us the impression that this issue may be an optional ingredient and we think that is much too important to leave out. Now, we also recognise that as our built spaces change, there will inevitably be occasions when compromises are called for. So we're proposing that the city establish a mechanism for a compensation for degradation of solar access as a condition for developments to go ahead. And you can do slide 3 now, please. So this would provide more flexibility than a simple yes or no rezoning decisions, and should provide builders incentives to come up with creative solutions to preserve neighbourhood solar access, instead of just building to the maximum allowed envelope and lot coverage. Okay, so my next slide 4. My other topic is about how communities can transition to their new local area plans in ways that are orderly and predictable. We are concerned that this seems to be a missing ingredient from the guidebook. Perhaps it's meant to be implicit, but if so, I didn't spot it myself. If we think about what happens after a community area has been approved for intensification, in the absence of any plan for sequencing new builds, people have got no idea when a new hulking structure may be approved next door. Such transitions may take many years, depending on market conditions. So this leads to communities in limbo, neglect, and finally in desertion in favour of developers with deep pockets. An example of how this might be addressed, and you can go to slide 5, and there are doubtless many other examples, but one in particular is we do require that in the intensification progresses inwards from corner lots, given that you're allowed some intensification. But our guidebook, the point for our guidebook is that it's really important to direct this issue to be addressed within the local area plans. Slide 6, please. So why are we, Climate Hub and Sustainable Calgary, raising these two issues, bearing in mind we support the guidebook concepts as a way forward? For us, it's not just about calming fears in the hope that the guidebook will be adopted. The issues also speak to our core values. In terms of orderly transitions, these help community stability and enable those who are committed to living in the area to have a stake in the future. This is really important in dealing with long-term challenges of climate change and sustainability. That is the long-term aspect of this. In terms of solar access, of course, everyone wants sunlight where they live. So moving ever further into the suburbs shouldn't be the only option. And we've all seen what happens when a city core becomes depopulated, and your administration have well outlined the consequences of that, and it certainly, we believe, leads to a bigger carbon footprint and an unsustainable city. So we need to keep sunlight in order to have established communities, vibrant and attractive places to live. Okay. And thank you for listening, and I'll stay on the line for any questions.
Thanks very much, Mr. Longson. Let's go to Ms. Robertson, please.
Okay, I also had a presentation and some slides.
I think we've got it up, so go ahead.
Okay, thanks. My name is Natalie Robertson. I'm a Calgary-based urban resilience consultant and strategist. I specialize in the relationship between urban planning and climate change adaptation and mitigation. I was also a member of the Northville Working Group. From a climate perspective, the guidebook is needed. We need to densify, and it's better to do it thoughtfully rather than haphazardly. The guidebook lays the groundwork for that. Sprawl is expensive in terms of carbon and finances, and our pattern of constant expansion is unfeasible. Yesterday, the Honourable Jim Dinning mentioned including reality into the guidebook, and while his version of reality was pretty selective, the reality for all of us is that we need to act on the climate. And we have an opportunity to do that, and I do not want to see it squandered. Densification is the future. Can we go to the next slide, please? And the guidebook will help us do this. Along the way, with density, we increase transit use on routes that already exist and so keep a lid on our transportation greenhouse gas emissions. But not if that density is constantly relegated into multifamily buildings in new suburbs on the edge of the city that require a car to get everywhere. The opportunity I'm talking about is found on pages 74 and 75 of the guidebook in the section on comprehensive planning sites. This section refers to the redevelopment of brownfield sites larger than 1 hectare that fall outside the parameters of a local area plan. Midfield Trailer Park is one of those sites. Councillor Carra mentioned yesterday that Midfield missed out on some big moves, and he's right. The proposed amendment submitted by the Hub today and Sustainable Calgary in relation to these types of sites is another missed big move. Next slide, please. The opportunity these sites represent should not be underestimated. Their potential to support the city's climate targets and mitigate extreme weather risks and vulnerabilities into the future should not be ignored or wasted. Their potential as city-building projects to draw the world's eye to Calgary for all the right reasons and demonstrate our capacity and innovation can attract talent, investment, and jobs. These sites are found dotted around the city. Marlborough Mall, North Hill Mall, Westbrook Mall, and while there is more than one, they still represent a rare opportunity because we have the chance to build not just from the ground up, but from the underground up. Identifying opportunities is mentioned in the guidebook currently, but that's not enough. We need to capitalize on these opportunities. Midfield site is an excellent example of incorporating increased energy efficiency in buildings with the NECB, but does not go far enough given the climate projections the city uses out to 2050 and 2080. We need policy and legislation to back up the opportunity with action. Legislation that requires brownfield sites to be more. Something, excuse me? Something.
We're getting a little bit of background noise, so once again, everyone hit mute. Keep going, Ms. Robertson.
Okay, we need something tied to what was discussed and presented by the Alberta Eco Trust yesterday evening. Next slide, please. Not only can we densify established areas in neighborhoods with existing routes, for transit and emptying schools, main streets that need revitalizing, we have the chance to install innovative and efficient technology like they did in Southeast False Creek with waste heat capture. Next slide, please. With large sites, we can create dense townhouse and low-rise mixed-use communities that do not have car use and ownership as a default requirement. Brownfields that, because they are on sites measured in hectares, contain the potential of installing large-scale systems like communal solar arrays or other local district networks. Next slide, please. Apart from density, mixed-use communities encourage walking and transit use. As Councillor Farrell pointed out, the intent is to create a type of village with a variety of housing choices that work. For seniors, because maybe they can't drive, or for families, because the streets are for living, not just cars, and for low-income workers or students, because electricity and heat are cheaper with on-site generation, and default vehicle ownership or buying parking spaces is eliminated by the design. And for anyone else who wants to live close and not spend their time driving everywhere to everything all the time, much like the student from Mount Royal University wanted who spoke yesterday. Everyone should have that option, not just those of us who are fortunate enough to live in older established areas. Last slide, please. A multi-hectare site in an established area of the city is an opportunity worth exploiting to its fullest extent. It needs bold vision and direction because it will not happen by itself. It was done for the East Village when the parking requirements for the condo were eliminated. The amendment proposed to the guidebook on pages 74 and 75 is compatible with other recommendations submitted by the Climate Hub today in terms of solar access. It's compatible with our density targets. It's compatible and actively supports other city documents and initiatives approved by this council, like Main Streets, Resilient Strategy, the MDP, the Transportation Plan, and it will help balance our city's carbon budget.
Right.
Okay,
Ms. Robertson, you are at time, so I'll ask you to wrap up, please.
I have one sentence left. Let's approve the guidebook, make a couple of amendments, and get on with the business of building something cool in a world that is rapidly heating up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Dr. Miller, please. Are you there, Dr. Miller?
Yes, I am.
Please go ahead.
Okay. I also have a presentation. I could put that up, please.
All right. It is up. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. My name is Byron Miller. By the way, good morning, Your Worship and members of council. I am a professor of geography and the coordinator of the Urban Studies program at the University of Calgary, although this morning I'm speaking as a citizen who is a member of Sustainable Calgary and the Calgary Climate Hub. If we can go to the second image, please. The guidebook is a very important step in the right direction, providing a broad framework for the creation of local area plans that will advance Calgarians' goals of creating a more livable, equitable, and sustainable city. And this has been well established through a variety of processes, such as Imagine Calgary, the public feedback on Planet, and a number of other public participation exercises. But I would also argue that as a living document, we should consider amendments to the guidebook that will help turn its aspirational statements, such as, and this is a direct quote, provide housing options that are varied, inclusive, and affordable, into reality. In its current iteration, there are no specific mechanisms in the guidebook that will achieve this very laudable and important goal. So next slide, please. This should be the third one. Let's put the affordable and inclusive housing goal of the guidebook into a bit of context. As it stands, Calgary shows a very high degree of socioeconomic polarization. This is related to the geography of housing opportunities, and I committed the sin of providing you with a map that doesn't have a legend, but there's really only one thing on this that I want to call your attention to, and that is the black and white cross-hatched areas toward the center of the city, the inner city. These are the areas of very high income in Calgary. These are areas where you have 140% to 377% of the average CMA income. These are the very highest income areas of the city, and they're strongly associated with inner city established neighborhoods. Next slide, please. Moreover, the geography of income change has been very uneven. This map shows income change from 1980 to 2015, and that, again, cross-hatched black and white area in the center of the city is the area where income has gone up the most, anywhere from 10% to 187% of the Calgary CMA average. So, in other words, the established neighborhoods, by and large, are among the better off areas of the city, and relatively speaking, they continue to become better off than the rest of the city. This has led to our current situation, where Calgary is either the most polarized or the second most polarized city in Canada, depending on which statistical measure you look at. Next slide, please. So these changes associated with this polarization have been largely market-driven. They have gone hand in hand with densification, and they've gone hand in hand with the diversification of housing types. In other words, the common argument that densification and housing diversification will provide greater socioeconomic diversification and mixing has not been borne out by the evidence. And this is true, I mean, certainly we see this example in Calgary, but we've seen it in a number of other cities as well. Next slide, please. I am certainly not arguing against densification and housing diversification. There are many significant benefits to densification and market-oriented housing diversification, but housing affordability and reduced socioeconomic polarization aren't among them. And this is fairly widely recognized among academics, planners, and even some elected officials. So, for instance, former Vancouver Planning Director Brent Todarian, discussing Vancouver's densification policies in 2007, observed, this is a direct quote, "Eco-density won't provide housing that meets average incomes. I don't think we could affect housing policy to the point that prices would go down." And then in Edmonton in 2018, City Council recognized the limitations of relying on a market-based approach to affordable housing and adopted a policy target of at least 16% affordable housing in every neighborhood to make sure that affordable housing isn't concentrated in particular neighborhoods, but rather is available throughout the city. The city is currently developing a suite of policies to achieve this goal. So, next slide, please. As it stands, the guidebook contains no mechanisms for achieving its inclusive and affordable housing goals other than densification and the market. and 4 points on this. One is that this will not get the job done. Secondly, Calgary desperately needs to address and reverse its increasing social and spatial polarization. But three, development of established communities without policies explicitly designed to ensure adequate affordable housing will likely worsen Calgary's polarization. And finally, this is an extremely serious problem for reasons ranging from inequity in access to jobs and civic amenities, constrained social capital formation, weakened civic bonds, and greater and longer commuting to jobs, services, and more, resulting in greater energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. So the social and the environmental...
You are at time, Dr. Miller, so I'm just going to ask you to wrap up, please.
Okay, I'm just moving to the very last image here. So 4 quick points. It's not too late to design policies and mechanisms to ensure the provision of sufficient affordable housing in every neighborhood. We do not have to invent the wheel. There are many examples of affordable housing policies in many cities around Canada and the world. Third, the Guidebook, through its densification policies, and this is actually a very important point, will produce hundreds of millions of dollars, very conservatively, of increased land value. A portion of this can be captured through various land value capture mechanisms to fund the provision of affordable housing. And then finally, I would suggest that the city appoint a working group to develop a suite of policies that will ensure the provision of sufficient affordable housing as neighborhoods redevelop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miller. That brings us to the end of our panel. I thought I saw a request to speak in here. Councillor Curragh?
Yeah, I know you're getting aggravated with me, Your Worship, and the rest of Council, and I realize we've got a lot of citizens to hear from. I just wanted to ask 2 questions. The first one is for Chris Longson. I was interested in your presentation. It begs a question that I think a lot of people have sort of put on the Guidebook, right? The idea is that the Guidebook is going to change the game for Calgary in terms of allowing all kinds of densification. I guess my question to Mr. Longson is, have not the ability for these things to happen already in both policy and land use process existed in Calgary for at least a decade? And how do you see the Guidebook and your critiques of it changing a status quo? Because I don't see that it does.
I think that's a matter for... I think there are lots of inadequacies in...
Is he speaking, Your Worship?
Oh, we lost you, Mr. Longson. Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Here we go.
Okay. I said, I see there's something to be addressed when you're formulating the local area plans, if I understand your process correctly.
Well, yeah, I mean, also the access to ancient light is a British planning tradition that has existed in British common law but does not exist here, and it would be a very difficult one to sort of claw in. But I do agree a lot of what you talked about is a local area planning consideration, but I didn't see the connection to the Guidebook. I'd like to move on to Professor Miller. I thought that was incredibly interesting, Dr. Miller. I actually dropped out of a PhD program studying affordability years ago with Dr. Miller.
Our program's loss was the city's gain.
Well, thank you. My question to you is, I think it's really important, the point you're making, that densification alone is not enough to reduce socioeconomic polarization. My question to you, though, is it a base condition? Can you reduce socioeconomic polarization without densification, or do you need to do densification but also do other things?
I would say the latter. I'm certainly not opposed to densification, but I think in some respects it's been oversold as being the solution to all problems. And I think in addition to densification, we do need to have some measures that more directly address the issues that we're concerned with.
Okay, well, I really appreciate your sort of putting that data-driven lens on the project that's before us, and the warning that densification alone is not enough. And I agree with you completely. It was that realization in private practice that led me to start a PhD with you to figure out how to fix that.
All right,
Thank you.
Councillor Carra. Thank you. I was just reminding Councillor Carra and all of my colleagues that the purpose of the questions to people who have taken their time to be with us today is to either get a little more information, but to focus on information that will actually change how you're thinking about something. So with that, Councillor Farrell, please.
Thank you. My question is for Mr. Miller as well. I thank you for your presentation. I think we need to follow up with you and get some more information and perhaps even some amendments for the guidebook. Mr. Miller, it's been my experience that while diverse communities regarding housing type are more accepting of affordable housing than communities that are more homogeneous. And so do you see that? I'm just thinking of the Rosedale experience with the 16 small homes and just the level of outrage. It was really tragic. But and then the community of Hillhurst Sunnyside that is already diverse with housing type, also very high-end community, but very accepting, in fact, demanding of affordable housing. And I think having that acceptance of people who are different than you is one step to getting affordable housing.
I would certainly agree with that. And I guess the one thing I would add to that is that also affordable housing does not have to be unattractive housing. It can actually be designed to be quite attractive and be viewed as a community asset. And, I think that's perhaps one part of the solution to the problem is to make sure that when affordable housing goes in, it is viewed as very attractive.
Yes. I would like to follow up with you. We could debate and I could learn a lot from you, but I won't take any more time. I have about 10 more questions. I'm not going to do that. Thank you for your presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone, and thank you to this panel. We are going to start with panel 9 now.